She was a virgin, a teacher. She dreamed of becoming a mother, but had never truly been loved. He was a billionaire, cold, surrounded by luxury, yet completely empty inside. One unexpected night, amidst glasses and old silences, he made an unthinkable request. Would you have a child with me? No love, no romance, just trust. But when they crossed the line of friendship, something was awakened, and what seemed simple turned into something far from what they expected. But what happened after that night, no one could ever imagine. If this story touches you in any way, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us, where are you listening from? Your support is what keeps this space alive and allows stories like this to reach other hearts too. The soft clinking of silverware against porcelain echoed gently through the private dining room, where candlelight flickered across the wine glasses. Isabel Thompson sat across from Ryan Cooper, her fingers nervously toying with the edge of her linen napkin. She wasn't used to this kind of setting. White tablecloths, hand-selected menus, a view of Manhattan's glowing skyline stretching out behind them. But with Ryan, things always felt strangely familiar, even when everything around them screamed opulence. She looked up and met his eyes, those piercing, steel-blue eyes that had seen boardrooms, battlefields of business, and 100 cities around the world, but somehow still softened when they landed on her. "Why did you bring me here, Ryan?" she asked, her voice gentle, cautious. Ryan took a deep breath. He looked older tonight, not in years, but in weight, like he'd been carrying something inside him for a long time and had finally decided to lay it down. "I need to ask you something," he said, leaning forward, his expression unreadable, "and I need you to hear me with your heart, not with your logic." Isabel blinked, suddenly uneasy. She had known Ryan since she was 10 and he was 17, the boy who helped her learn to ride a bike, the one who bought her first novel when she self-published it at 13, the one who secretly wired money to fix her mum's car when they couldn't afford it. And now, he looked like a man who was about to change everything. "I want a child, Isabel." Her breath hitched. "You... what?" "I want to be a father. I've thought about adopting. I've looked into surrogacy, but none of it felt right. Not until I thought about you." She sat back, heart pounding in her chest. "I trust you," he said, voice calm but firm. "More than anyone in this world, and I know you've always dreamed of being a mother." She nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the glass in front of her. That part was true. "I'm not asking for a relationship or a marriage, just a child, shared, raised in love, between two people who already know they can count on each other." The room grew heavy with silence. Outside the windows, the city buzzed like it always did, alive with the noise of dreams and collisions. But inside, there was only breath, and tension, and history. "You're asking me," Isabel whispered, "to have your baby." He nodded. "But not because we're in love." Ryan hesitated. "No, because I believe in what we already are. And because maybe, just maybe, love isn't the only way to start something beautiful." She looked at him, really looked. This was the man who once carried her out of a thunderstorm when she twisted her ankle on a hiking trail. The same man who flew across the country just to attend her mother's funeral and hold her hand in silence. But was that enough? "I need time," she said, standing abruptly. Her heart was a hurricane. "I can't say yes to something like this, not tonight." He didn't try to stop her, just nodded. "I'll wait." That night, Isabel walked home alone, despite Ryan's offer of a car. The city lights blurred in her eyes as questions spiraled through her mind. She wanted a child, yes, but not like this, or maybe exactly like this. By the time she reached her tiny apartment in Willow Creek, she was shivering with confusion. She needed guidance, and she knew exactly where to go. The next morning, she drove to the edge of town, where the grass was taller and the trees whispered secrets only the wise could hear. Mrs. Martha Bell lived in a cottage surrounded by lavender bushes and wind chimes. She had once been Isabel's mentor, her high school English teacher, and later her greatest confidant. Martha opened the door with that warm, knowing smile. "You've come with something on your heart," she said before Isabel could even speak. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Yes." Inside, they sat by the fire. Isabel told her everything about Ryan's proposal, her confusion, her fear of doing something untraditional, about wanting to be a mother, but also wanting more than just biology. When she finished, Martha just watched the flames for a moment. Sometimes, the older woman said softly, God gives us the seed before we understand the garden. Isabel frowned. What do you mean? I mean, you don't always get the love first, or the marriage, or even the certainty. Sometimes you just get the invitation, and you have to decide whether to step in with faith. Isabel stared into the fire. But what if I say yes, and it ruins us? Martha smiled. Or what if it's the one thing that finally reveals what's been there all along? Days passed. Isabel went through every scenario in her mind. She avoided Ryan's calls, not out of anger, but because she didn't yet have her answer. Until one night, she stood in her bedroom, hand resting on her heart, and whispered aloud, If I wait for perfect, I might miss what's real. She grabbed her phone. Ryan, she said, when he answered breathless on the first ring, I'll do it, but on my terms. His silence was thick with relief. Anything. Name them. I want to carry this child naturally. I want to live this journey fully. No walls, no coldness. I need to feel everything, not pretend it's a business deal. You have my word. I'll teach until my 7th month. I'll stay in my home, and I need to know that no matter what happens between us, you'll be there. Not just legally, emotionally. I wouldn't have asked you if I didn't mean that. There was a pause, a long, reverent silence that neither rushed. Then Isabel said the words that changed both of their lives. Let's begin. But neither of them could have imagined what that beginning would truly mean, or what the journey ahead was silently preparing to reveal. The silence after the call with Ryan lingered in the air like incense, slow burning and sacred. Isabel sat on the edge of her bed, her phone still in her hand, her heart thudding softly beneath her ribs. She had said yes. She had stepped into the unknown, eyes wide open, heart trembling. But now that the words were out of her mouth, now that she had agreed, the weight of that yes began to bloom inside her, like something she couldn't quite hold yet. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was something deeper. Something like reverence. She stood, walked barefoot across her wooden floor, and opened the window. A breeze drifted in, cold, clean, and filled with the scent of night jasmine. Willow Creek was quiet at this hour. The stars above her hometown glittered like questions waiting to be asked. She whispered to the darkness, Am I doing the right thing? But no answer came. Just the sound of wind and the memory of Ryan's voice promising, I'll be there no matter what. The next morning she went to the school early, long before the children's laughter would echo down the hallways. She stood in her classroom, fingers tracing the edges of the small wooden desks, the chalkboard still dusty from yesterday's lesson. Her world was built on routine, on structure, on simple joys, teaching poetry, calming nerves before spelling tests, tying a shoelace for a kindergartner who cried over loose knots. And now that world would shift, grow, crack open. As she adjusted a crooked painting on the wall, she caught her reflection in the glass. Soft brown eyes, hair still a little messy, a woman holding her breath in front of her own future. Could she really carry a child, raise a human, with someone she'd never kissed until now? Could she separate friendship from longing if her heart started to hope for more? And what if Ryan didn't feel the same? The thought stung. That evening she drove back to the edge of town, gravel crunching beneath her tires, and returned to the lavender-lined porch where her mentor lived. Mrs. Martha Bell greeted her without surprise, just a warm nod and a gesture toward the back garden. They sat under a canopy of wisteria. Birds chirped in the distance. The sun filtered through the leaves like golden lace. You said yes, Martha murmured, handing her a cup of chamomile tea. Isabel nodded slowly. But now I'm scared. That's good, Martha replied, smiling softly. It means you're awake. I thought saying yes would bring peace, but now it feels like I've stepped into fog. That's what it always feels like when something sacred begins. Isabel looked down at her tea. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I imagined falling in love first, that getting married, planning a nursery together. But this She looked up, voice cracking. This isn't a fairy tale. It's complicated, unwritten. Martha reached out, her hand warm and steady on Isabel's. Darling, some stories are too true to be fairy tales. There was a silence between them, rich and meaningful. I'm worried I'll fall in love with him, Isabel confessed. That I'll want more, and he won't. Martha studied her face. And what if you already have? Isabel's breath caught. She hadn't said it out loud, not even to herself. But it had been there, blooming quietly, stubbornly, since the night he held her after the first failed attempt. Since the moment his hand brushed hers, like a promise not yet spoken. I don't want to ruin what we have. Martha tilted her head. But isn't it already becoming something else? Isabel nodded slowly. Yes, it is. Martha leaned back and looked out toward the garden. Sometimes God doesn't give us the answers right away. He gives us people, paths, doors we never expected to open. Then she turned to Isabel, and he gives us the strength to walk through them, even trembling. That night, Isabel couldn't sleep. Her thoughts moved in circles, like water trapped in a glass. She got up, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and went out to the porch of her small cottage. She sat there, legs curled beneath her, watching the moonlight dance on the grass. Her phone sat beside her, screen dark. Her fingers twitched to call Ryan, to hear his voice, to ask him, "Do you feel what I feel?" But she didn't, not yet. Instead, she closed her eyes and whispered the prayer she'd whispered as a girl under her grandmother's quilt. God, if this is from you, help me walk through it. Even if it doesn't look like the story I imagined, let it be better, let it be real. And somehow, in the stillness of the night, something inside her shifted, not like an answer, but like a soft light beginning to grow. 2 days later, Ryan called. I scheduled the appointment for next week, he said, his voice hesitant. For the insemination, unless you're having second thoughts. She closed her eyes and took a breath. No, I'm not. Okay, he said. Then, softer. Are you okay? I'm figuring it out, she replied honestly. But I still mean it. I'm ready. There was silence on the line, full of unsaid things. Then Ryan whispered, I'm really glad it's you. She smiled. Me too. The week passed quickly. School, lesson plans, evenings filled with lavender tea and long walks alone. Isabel began journaling again, something she hadn't done since college. Her entries weren't polished. They weren't for anyone else. They were raw and open, full of questions and confessions. One night she wrote, I think I'm falling for him in the quiet. Not in grand gestures, but in the way he listens. In how he remembers small things. In how I feel when he looks at me. Like I'm not invisible. Like I'm safe. She folded the page and tucked it beneath her pillow. The night before the appointment, Ryan picked her up for dinner. They went to a little restaurant in the hills outside the city. Not the usual Manhattan flash, but a place with fairy lights and homemade bread. Over dessert, he reached across the table. Are you nervous? She nodded. Me too, he said. They laughed quietly, the sound soft and unsure. Then he looked at her, really looked him, and said, You know, this doesn't have to be cold or clinical. We're not strangers. No, she agreed. We're not. The way he held her gaze made something flutter inside her chest. I'll be with you every step, he said. Even if it's hard, even if it doesn't work. We'll try again, we'll figure it out. It wasn't a grand romantic speech, but somehow, it was the most loving thing anyone had ever said to her. Later that night, when he dropped her off, they stood by her front door. The air smelled like honeysuckle and rain. Ryan leaned in slightly, not for a kiss, but just to be near. Tomorrow, he said, voice low, we take the first step. She nodded, heart thudding. But before she could answer, something happened. A clap of thunder echoed in the distance. The wind picked up slightly, and in that fleeting moment, something unsaid passed between them. Something that had always been there, waiting. The sun streamed through the blinds of Isabel's cottage, striping her bedroom walls with pale gold as she stood barefoot, watching herself in the mirror. Her hand rested lightly on her belly, though there was nothing there yet. Not really, just the possibility of something. a future, a heartbeat, a promise still sealed inside her decision. She had said yes, not out of impulse, not out of pressure, but because deep down, beneath the doubts and fears, she believed that something extraordinary could be born out of trust. Still, she wouldn't go into this blindly. If this journey was hers, she needed to shape it on her own terms. Later that afternoon, Ryan arrived. He didn't knock. He never had to. Their friendship had been forged in too many unspoken understandings. Still, today felt different. He stepped into the living room quietly, dressed in one of those charcoal grey suits that always made him look even more untouchable. But then his eyes met hers, and all that armor fell away. He looked like a man waiting for permission to hope. "Hi," he said softly. Isabel nodded, trying not to let her heartbeat drown out her thoughts. "We need to talk." Ryan's jaw tensed slightly, but he nodded, motioning for her to sit first. She led him to the worn couch by the window, the one with a cushion that always sagged too far on the left. She folded her hands, steadying herself. "If I'm going to do this," she began, "it can't be just your plan. It has to be ours." Ryan leaned in. "I agree. I want to carry this child naturally, no clinics, no artificial steps. If we're going to bring a life into this world, I want it to start, as life does, real, human, warm." A flicker passed through Ryan's eyes, surprise, maybe even vulnerability. "Are you sure?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, I want to feel everything, even if it's confusing." He exhaled through his nose, then leaned back with a short laugh. "I thought I was prepared for this conversation, but clearly I wasn't." Isabel half smiled. "I also want to keep teaching until my 7th month. That part of me doesn't disappear just because I'm pregnant." "Of course," he said without hesitation. "Whatever you need." She hesitated, fingers brushing against the hem of her sweater. "And I want to stay here, in my home, at least until the baby is born." Ryan blinked, as if the request surprised him. "You don't want to move in with me?" "Not yet," she replied. "I need space to breathe. I need to feel like I haven't lost myself in all this." Ryan nodded again, slower this time. "Okay. But most of all," she continued, "I need to know this won't change how we talk. I need to know you'll still be my friend, that I won't be alone in this emotionally." There was a long silence. Then Ryan reached out and gently took her hand. "You've never been alone, Isabel, and you never will be." His words were simple, but they pressed into her heart like a seal. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment, she believed him. The next few days unfolded with a strange blend of tenderness and anticipation. Ryan didn't push, didn't rush her. Instead, he started showing up in small, unexpected ways. A thermos of fresh squeezed juice left on her porch before work, a delivery of prenatal vitamins, thoughtfully packed in a canvas bag with lavender soap, a message after her morning class, "Thinking of you, not hovering, just here." She didn't respond to every message, but she read them all twice. And on one particularly rainy Thursday, she walked into her kitchen to find a bouquet of pale yellow peonies, her favorite, with a handwritten note that simply said, "Because you're doing something brave." Isabel pressed the card to her chest and let herself cry just for a moment. Not out of sadness, but because for the first time she didn't feel like she was walking into motherhood alone. They agreed to spend the weekend together, somewhere outside the city, where no one would ask questions and no one would expect anything. Just the two of them. No contracts, no checklists, just breath and time. They drove upstate to a lakeside cottage Ryan had rented quietly. Isabel laughed when she saw it, not because it was extravagant, but because it wasn't. It was simple. Wooden walls, a fireplace, a swing hanging from an old oak tree in the yard. "You picked this," she teased. Ryan grinned. "Don't sound so surprised. I grew up in a town like this, remember?" She nodded, remembering. Back when he was just a lanky teenager with 2 big shoes and a grin that softened her worst days. They spent Saturday making pancakes, reading side by side and walking barefoot through the wet grass. It was the first time in weeks she felt like herself again. That night after dinner, Ryan lit a fire and poured them both tea. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause. "What if this turns into more? Isabel's heart skipped. What do you mean? I mean, us. I know we said no romance, but I keep wondering if we said that because we were scared. She stared into the flames, her fingers tightening around her mug. I've wondered the same thing, she admitted. But if we cross that line, there's no going back, he finished for her. The room filled with a silence so charged it felt like lightning waiting for a place to land. Then Ryan stood and walked toward her, slowly, carefully. He sat beside her, eyes searching hers, and for the first time she saw something in them she hadn't dared name until now. Longing. Not lust, not possession, but a kind of ache that had waited years to be seen. If we're going to do this, he whispered, then let's do it with open hearts, even if it scares us. Her breath caught. He leaned closer, so close she could feel his warmth, the cedar on his shirt, the faintest touch of cinnamon on his breath. And then, just before their lips could meet, Isabel closed her eyes. She didn't pull away, but she also didn't move. A pause, a heartbeat, a storm gathering quietly on the horizon of something beautiful. The morning of the procedure arrived beneath a pale, indifferent sky. Isabel stood in front of the mirror, dressed in a soft blue sweater and jeans that suddenly felt too tight, her hands trembling slightly as she braided her hair over one shoulder. It was a small detail, but it gave her something to focus on, something to control. In the mirror's reflection, she caught a glimpse of herself and tried to imagine what she might look like pregnant. Would her body change dramatically? Would she feel different? Would people see her and know that something sacred was growing inside? A knock on the door pulled her from the thought. Ryan stood there, holding a coffee and a paper bag. I didn't know if you'd eaten, he said gently. I brought your favorite, the strawberry scone from that little place on 9th Street. She smiled faintly. Thanks. He followed her inside, setting the bag on the counter without saying much. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy but familiar. The weight of what was ahead sat between them like a third presence neither of them could see, but both could feel pressing on their lungs. You ready? He asked. No, she answered honestly. Ryan nodded. Me neither. The clinic was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that made everything feel more sterile than it already was. The walls were white, the lights too bright. The receptionist had a voice like crushed ice, cheerful but hollow. Isabel sat in the waiting room beside Ryan, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her, a magazine lay open on a table to a picture of a mother holding a newborn. She couldn't bring herself to look at it for long. When the nurse finally called her name, Ryan stood too. You can wait here, Isabel said softly, but he shook his head. No, I want to be there, even if I can't do anything. She didn't argue. Inside the room, the process was clinical, brief and cold. Isabel lay on the exam table, staring at the ceiling, her legs trembling beneath the thin blanket. Ryan sat beside her, holding her hand in silence. It's done, the doctor finally said with a professional smile. Now we wait. Wait. The word echoed in her mind like a sentence. They left the clinic under a grey sky that mirrored the strange hollowness inside her. Ryan opened the car door for her, and neither of them spoke for the entire ride home. That night Isabel couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the sterile lights, the doctor's voice, the pressure in her lower abdomen. It all felt too mechanical, too impersonal. This wasn't what she imagined motherhood would feel like. She got up around 2 in the morning and went into the kitchen, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. A storm had rolled in. Soft rain tapped at the windows, and distant thunder mumbled across the sky like a restless god. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Ryan standing there in a hoodie and sweatpants, soaked from the rain, holding a thermos. I couldn't sleep either, he said quietly. I thought maybe we could not sleep together. She let him in without a word. They sat on the floor of her living room, backs against the couch, sharing hot chocolate in silence. I thought it would feel more magical, Isabel whispered after a long time. Like something sacred. Ryan turned his head to look at her. I know. Me too. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. What if it doesn't work? What if it never works? Then we try again, he said without hesitation. as many times as it takes. But what if, her voice cracked, what if it breaks me first? Ryan took her mug from her trembling hands and set it down, then reached over and pulled her into his arms. You're not alone in this, he whispered into her hair. If it hurts, I'll carry the pain with you. If it breaks you, I'll help rebuild. The sincerity in his voice undid her. She leaned into him, letting the sob rise from her chest and fall against his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He just held her tighter. The days passed like waiting rooms, quiet, still, filled with tension you could almost taste. Every cramp made Isabel anxious. Every wave of nausea or lack thereof made her question everything. She read articles, she avoided forums, she prayed quietly while brushing her teeth. She tried not to want it too much. And then one morning the spotting began. At first, she told herself it could be normal, that sometimes implantation caused that. But as the hours passed, the reality set in. She wasn't pregnant. Her chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with her body. She sat on her bed, knees pulled up, the test beside her like a cruel joke. She had dreamed of this moment as a celebration, not as another empty space. The doorbell rang. She didn't answer it, but Ryan had the key. He walked in quietly, as if he already knew. She didn't move as he entered the room, didn't look at him, just stared ahead, eyes fixed on a crack in the wall. It didn't work, she said flatly. I know, he replied gently. She hated how tender his voice was. It made her want to cry all over again. I feel stupid, she whispered, for hoping, for believing it would happen so easily. Ryan sat beside her on the bed and took her hand in both of his. You're not stupid, he said. You're brave. She shook her head. I feel empty. He looked at her for a long moment, then stood and disappeared into the kitchen. When he returned, he was holding a small notebook and a pen. He handed it to her. Write it. What? Everything you're feeling. The sadness, the anger, the hope. Don't let it rot inside you. Isabel stared at the blank page, then slowly began to write. Her handwriting was messy at first, uneven from the tears, but the more she wrote, the clearer her heart became. When she finished, she looked up. I don't want to try again. Not right away. Ryan nodded. Okay, but I also don't want to give up. He smiled softly. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard you say. That night they lay on the couch, the rain returning outside in quiet taps. He pulled the blanket over both of them. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Somehow, in the silence, a new closeness had formed, one that didn't rely on hope or plans or expectations, one that simply was. And as Isabel drifted off with her head on Ryan's shoulder, her last thought was not of failure, but of something just beginning to grow between them, quietly, like a seed planted in grief and watered by tenderness. 2 weeks had passed since the failed procedure, and yet something had shifted between them, softly, invisibly, like spring beginning to breathe beneath the soil. Isabel no longer felt alone in her disappointment. She carried it differently now, shared, not just with Ryan, but with someone who had stayed through the silence. It was a quiet Saturday morning when Ryan called. No pressure, he said after a moment of small talk, but I spoke with the doctor. They said we could try again whenever you're ready. Isabel looked out the window at the wind blowing through the maple trees. Something inside her no longer resisted, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she wasn't doing this alone. I think I'm ready, she said, her voice steady but low. Okay, Ryan replied gently. Then let's try again. Together. This time, everything felt different. He picked her up early, but instead of heading straight to the clinic, he drove her to a quiet park just outside the city. It was the kind of place you only discovered by accident, tucked between trees, with a lake so still it looked like glass. I wanted you to breathe first, he said, as they stepped out of the car. Isabel smiled, surprised. You remember this place? I remember everything, he said, eyes fixed on her. They sat on a wooden bench, watching ducks glide across the water. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, even comforting. She rested her head on his shoulder. He didn't move. You don't have to fix it all, she murmured. Just being here is enough. Ryan looked down at her, and for a moment, he said nothing. But his hand found hers and held it, firm and safe. The second procedure was quick, familiar now. But instead of white walls and cold silence, something had changed. Ryan brought her a playlist of soft piano songs to play during the wait. He made a corny joke to the nurse that made her laugh too loudly, and when it was over, he kissed the top of Isabel's head like it was something he'd always done. They left the clinic with fingers lightly interlaced, neither of them questioning it. Back at his penthouse, he insisted she rest. "You're not my nurse," she teased. "I'm your friend," he corrected, placing a soft blanket over her legs. "And right now your body's doing something heroic." She laughed softly. "You sound like Martha," he grinned. "Then I must be doing something right." They spent the rest of the afternoon in his apartment. Isabel curled on the couch in one of his oversized sweaters, Ryan sitting beside her reading aloud from a novel she'd lent him years ago. The room was bathed in golden light. Outside the city buzzed, but inside it was all stillness, all peace. At one point she shifted to lie down fully, her head resting against his thigh as he read. His voice, calm and steady, lulled her almost to sleep. But then the chapter ended, and he closed the book, setting it gently aside. She looked up at him, eyes half-lidded from comfort. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For making today feel not like a procedure." He reached down, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered longer than they should have. "I just wanted it to feel like us." Their eyes locked. For a second, neither of them breathed. Then, slowly, Ryan leaned down. Isabel didn't move. His lips touched hers like a question, soft, trembling, hesitant. She answered with a kiss that said yes, not just to the moment, but to everything that had been growing in silence between them. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't wild. It was gentle, reverent, like a door finally being opened after years of waiting. When they parted, Ryan rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I know," she replied, "but I don't regret it." "Me neither." Afterward, they didn't talk about the kiss. Not right away, they just existed, closer than before, but still in that fragile space where friendship and something deeper begin to blur. Isabel stayed the night, too tired to drive home, and when she woke the next morning, she found Ryan in the kitchen making coffee, humming an old Beatles song off-key. He handed her a mug, their fingers brushing again. Everything felt new, and yet familiar. Over the next few days, they returned to their routines, but with a new awareness. He called more often. She answered faster. They sent each other small things, photos of sunsets, voice notes of late-night thoughts, memories that used to belong only to friendship and now felt like something blooming. But neither of them brought up the kiss. Maybe they were afraid to name it. Maybe they both needed more time. A week later, Ryan invited her over again. "I was thinking," he said as they ate takeout on his balcony, "maybe we should do something to celebrate, even if we don't know the outcome yet." "Celebrate what?" she asked, amused. He shrugged. "Courage, hope. Us." "Us" is a big word. Ryan looked at her, serious now. "It's a true one." She stared at him for a long time, the wind playing with the edge of her blouse. "I'm scared of what comes next," she admitted. "If it works, or if it doesn't." "I'm scared too," he said softly. "But I'd rather be scared with you than safe with anyone else." That night, as he walked her to the door, he didn't kiss her again, but he did take her hand. And he didn't let go until she was gone. The next morning, Isabel woke before dawn with a strange feeling, light, fluttery, almost like anticipation. She walked into her bathroom, brushed her teeth, and stared at her reflection. Something about her looked different, not visibly, not obviously, but something had changed. She reached for her journal and wrote only one sentence. "Maybe love doesn't come all at once. Maybe it's been here, waiting, the whole time." It started with silence. Not the heavy kind that comes from discomfort or confusion, but the kind that gently wraps itself around two people who no longer need words. That evening, the air in Ryan's penthouse felt different, less like space and more like presence. Isabel stood by the window, watching the lights of Manhattan flicker like distant fireflies, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. Behind her, Ryan moved slowly through the kitchen, his every gesture quiet and intentional. He poured 2 glasses of water, placed them on the table, then stopped, his eyes drawn to her silhouette outlined by the city. "You okay?" he asked. She turned, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I think so. I'm just here." He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Sometimes being was enough. They'd spent the evening in the simplest way possible. Homemade dinner, music playing low in the background, conversation that danced between laughter and quiet reflection. But something had been building all night, a current neither of them could name, but both had felt coming long before tonight. Isabel stepped away from the window, barefoot on the hardwood, and walked toward him. Ryan didn't move. He just watched her, his heart beating louder than it had in years. When she reached him, she stood close enough to feel his breath, close enough to hear the quiet inhale when her hand brushed lightly against his chest. "I don't know where this leads," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I know it's real." Ryan's fingers moved to her waist, hesitant at first, as if asking permission. She didn't pull away. "It's always been real," he murmured. The moment stretched, suspended between them like fragile glass, one touch away from shattering everything they thought they understood. Then she reached up and cupped his face with both hands, and kissed him. This time there was no hesitation, no holding back. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't practiced. It was raw, honest, and tender. A kiss that carried the weight of years unspoken, of fears softened by closeness, of love that had never dared speak its name until now. He led her slowly to the bedroom, fingers entwined in hers like a question being answered in silence. There was no rush, no urgency, just reverence. He stopped at the edge of the bed and looked at her, waiting. She nodded, a soft flush coloring her cheeks, not from shame but from vulnerability, from trust. "I've never," she began. "I know," he said softly. "I would never, unless you're sure." "I'm sure," she replied. "I want this. I want you." Something inside him broke in the most beautiful way. He reached for her face again, kissing her forehead, her cheek, the tip of her nose, before finally pressing his lips to hers with a slow, aching intensity. She breathed in, eyes fluttering shut. Each piece of clothing was removed with care, not urgency, like unwrapping something precious. Her body trembled beneath his touch, but never once with fear. His hands were gentle, exploring her as if memorizing sacred ground. And hers, though hesitant at first, grew more confident with every sigh, every heartbeat shared between them. When they finally came together, it was not just physical. It was emotional, almost spiritual. She gasped, her hands gripping the sheets, then his arms, then his back, as he whispered into her ear, "I've got you." Their bodies moved slowly, learning each other's rhythms, each breath deepening the connection. There was a point where she opened her eyes and looked into his, and in that moment something passed between them, silent, electric, eternal. It wasn't just her first time. It was his first time too. The first time he'd ever felt something so raw, so unshielded. The first time he let someone truly see him. Not the billionaire, not the strategist, but the man who once sat beside her at her mother's funeral, holding her hand for hours without saying a word. Now, she held him like he'd held her then. And when they collapsed into each other, breathless and trembling, it was not the end of a night, but the beginning of something irreversible. They lay there for a long time, her head resting on his chest, his fingers tracing invisible shapes along her shoulder. Neither of them spoke, but everything had already been said. The soft hum of the city below filled the room like a lullaby. Isabel felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness but from overwhelming peace. "I didn't think it would feel like this," she whispered finally. "Like what?" "Like I'd finally come home." Ryan didn't respond right away. He just tightened his hold on her, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I never wanted anyone else," he said almost to himself, "but I didn't know how to say it. Not until now." She tilted her head to look at him. "Say it now." "I love you," he said, voice raw and real. "I've loved you in ways I didn't understand. Quietly, completely. Probably since you were 17, and gave me that ridiculous poem about stardust and peanut butter." She laughed softly, burying her face in his chest. "You kept that poem?" "I framed it," he confessed. She looked up, startled. "You're joking." "I'm not." Their laughter mingled in the dark, warm and familiar. And then, quiet again. But this time it was the kind of quiet that only comes after truth, after surrender, after something beautiful is born in the space where fear used to live. Hours later, as dawn began to stretch its fingers across the horizon, Isabel lay awake, watching the first light kiss Ryan's face as he slept beside her. His features were relaxed, peaceful in a way she rarely saw when he was awake. He looked younger somehow, less burdened by the world. She brushed a fingertip across his cheek. And in that moment, something inside her whispered a truth she couldn't ignore. This wasn't part of the plan, but maybe this had always been the plan all along. 3 weeks later, the world felt both impossibly still and subtly off balance. Isabel stood barefoot in her bathroom, staring at the white plastic test lying silently on the counter. Her heart pounded like a warning and a prayer all at once. She hadn't told anyone, not even Ryan, that her body had started to change. The morning nausea, the aching in her chest, the odd cravings for oranges at midnight. She was late, and her intuition, once gentle and quiet, had started to roar. Now, standing in the golden light of early morning, she waited. The timer buzzed on her phone. Her hand trembled as she reached for the test. 2 lines. She blinked. Once. Twice. Still there. 2 bold, undeniable, impossible to misread lines. Positive. A soft gasp escaped her lips. Her legs gave slightly beneath her. She grabbed the counter for support, blinking rapidly as the tears gathered. She was pregnant. It had worked. It had actually worked. Her hands covered her mouth as a sob broke free. Quiet, stunned, joyous. She wasn't imagining it. This was real. Inside her, there was life. And it wasn't just about science or odds or the second attempt. It was about what had happened after. That night, the closeness, the love. Her fingers brushed lightly over her belly, and though it was still flat and unchanged, something sacred pulsed beneath her skin, a heartbeat waiting to be heard. She didn't tell Ryan right away, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted the moment to matter. She wanted it to be right. This wasn't just about sharing news, it was about changing their lives forever. So she waited. 2 days later, she invited him to her cottage for dinner. He arrived in his usual quiet confidence, bringing a bottle of non-alcoholic sparkling cider. Just in case, he joked, not knowing how prophetic the gesture was. They ate by candlelight, a slow meal of roasted vegetables and lemon pasta she'd made from scratch. Ryan complimented her 3 times, even though she could barely taste any of it over the nerves tangled in her chest. "You okay?" he asked gently, noticing her silence. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I have something to tell you." His fork paused midway to his mouth. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She stood up, walked over to the side table, and picked up a small gift box wrapped in navy paper. She handed it to him with a trembling smile. Ryan looked confused but took it. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was the pregnancy test, cleaned and dry, and beneath it a tiny pair of cream-colored baby socks. For a moment, he just stared. Time froze. Then, slowly, he looked up at her. "You're—" His voice cracked. She nodded, eyes shining. "Yes." He stood abruptly, the box still in his hands, and for a second she worried he was in shock. But then he let out a breathless laugh, a sound of disbelief and euphoria crashing together, and closed the distance between them in 2 steps. He lifted her off the ground in a tight embrace, spinning her around as tears slid down both their faces. "Are you sure?" he whispered into her hair, his voice shaking. "Positive," she said, laughing through her tears. "Literally." He pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands. "You're really carrying our baby." "I am." His forehead pressed to hers, breath shallow, reverent. "I've never been this happy in my life." And then he kissed her. Not a kiss of desire this time, but a kiss of but one of devotion, one of awe. They spent the rest of the night curled up on the couch, Ryan's hand resting protectively on her belly, even though there was nothing to see yet. "I want to do everything right," he said. "Appointments, vitamins, those weird cravings you're going to get at 2 a.m. I'm all in." She smiled. "What if I start crying randomly during commercials?" "I'll cry with you," he replied, completely serious. A pause. "Are you scared?" she asked. He didn't lie. "A little, but it's a good kind of scared, like before something sacred begins." She looked up at him, heart full. "Me too." The next morning, he walked her to her car before heading back to the city. Just before she opened the door, he paused. "I know we started this as an agreement," he said, his voice low, steady. "But it doesn't feel like that anymore." She turned to face him, the crisp autumn air brushing her cheek. "I know," she whispered. "I don't want to do this just as a father." Her eyes widened slightly. "I want to do this as the man who loves you, as the man who chooses you every day." Isabel's throat tightened. "Ryan, you don't have to say anything now," he added quickly. I needed you to know." She stepped forward and kissed him softly, on the cheek, close to his mouth, close to everything unsaid. "I do know," she said, "and it means everything." The next few weeks passed in a quiet, glowing rhythm. Isabel began taking prenatal vitamins. She bought a pregnancy journal and started writing in it each night. Ryan accompanied her to the first ultrasound appointment, holding her hand as the doctor turned the screen toward them and said, "There's the heartbeat." They both cried. Later, in the parking lot, he stood beside her and whispered, "I've built companies, bought islands, flown halfway across the world, but nothing compares to hearing that sound." She looked at him, her voice full of wonder. "We made that sound." One evening, as they sat on the porch of her cottage watching the sky darken into a pool of stars, Isabel turned to him. "Do you think we rushed into this?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think the world would say we did," he admitted. "But I also think sometimes the heart knows before the mind can catch up." She rested her head on his shoulder. "I just don't want us to lose each other in the chaos." "We won't," he said, wrapping his arm around her. "Because what we have isn't built on chance. It's built on everything we were before this, even before we knew what this was." And yet, even in that peace, something lingered in Isabel's mind. Not doubt, not regret, just the weight of everything changing so fast. She stood in front of the mirror that night, her hand on her stomach again, just like the morning of the test. But this time, she whispered a different question. "Am I ready to become someone new?" And in the quiet of the room, in the softness of her own reflection, the answer began to rise. The news spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. No announcement had been made, no press release, no social media post. But in a town where everyone's business echoed louder than church bells on a Sunday morning, Isabel's growing glow and the presence of a billionaire's car outside her cottage didn't go unnoticed for long. At first, it was whispers in the teacher's lounge. "She's pregnant, did you hear? With him, Ryan Cooper, the tech mogul? I thought they were just friends. Best friends don't get each other pregnant." Then it reached the parents and the school board. And by the following Monday morning, Isabel felt the shift before she even stepped through the school doors. It wasn't just the stares, it was the silence. Eyes that had once greeted her with warmth now flicked over her stomach like it was a scandal. Parents who used to smile at pickup turned away quickly, and then came the meeting. She was called into the principal's office at lunch. Mrs. Whitaker, a stiff woman with tightly braided hair and an even tighter worldview, sat across the desk, her expression unreadable. "We've had several calls," she began, folding her hands. "Concerns, questions." Isabel sat quietly, heart thudding. "I understand your situation is personal," Mrs. Whitaker continued, choosing each word like stepping across a minefield. "But this is a school, a small one. We're in a very traditional community." Isabel felt the familiar warmth rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from the sting of being reduced to a situation. "You're a beloved teacher, Isabel, but perhaps a temporary leave would be wise, just until the attention dies down." Isabel blinked. "You're asking me to disappear," she said softly. "I'm suggesting you protect your privacy." But they both knew the truth. It wasn't about privacy. It was about optics. That evening, Ryan arrived to find her sitting on the porch, still dressed in her work clothes, her posture too still. "What happened?" he asked, sitting beside her. She told him everything, and when she finished, he didn't speak immediately. He just reached for her hand. "I'll fix this," he said finally. She turned to him, eyes firm. "No, I'll face it." Ryan looked at her, surprised. "I won't hide," she continued. "Not because of gossip. Not because people can't handle something that doesn't fit in their little box. You shouldn't have to fight this alone." "I'm not," she said, squeezing his hand. "I have you, and I have my truth. That's more than most people." He didn't argue again. He just looked at her like she'd become something even more powerful than he remembered. Not just the girl he grew up with, but a woman walking through fire with her head held high. But the pressure didn't stop. Later that week, she overheard two parents in the school hallway, their voices lowered but sharp. "She's not even married. Who gets pregnant like that and expects people to respect her as a role model?" Isabel didn't confront them. She didn't need to. The hurt settled like dust, but it didn't crush her. Instead, she walked into her classroom, greeted her students with her usual warmth, and carried on as if the world hadn't shifted, because it had, but not in the way they thought. One evening, as the leaves turned gold and crimson around Willow Creek, Ryan surprised her with something unexpected. "Come with me," he said, showing up at her door without warning. She was tired, her feet swollen, her back sore. But she followed him anyway. He drove them just outside town to a small event space where he had gathered a group of former students, parents and friends, people who chose to support her. Each of them stood when she entered. Each of them had tears in their eyes. One by one, they shared stories. How Isabel had helped a child learn to read when no one else could. How she stayed after school to tutor a boy whose mother was dying. How her kindness had saved more than just grades. By the end of it, Isabel could barely speak. Her hand rested protectively over her growing belly, her eyes full of tears. When everyone left, Ryan turned to her. "Let them talk," he said softly. "The ones who matter already know who you are." She didn't say anything. She just kissed him, and something in her heart began to heal. Still, the judgment came in waves, a rumor that she had trapped Ryan, whispers that she was using the baby to gain status. But Isabel had made her choice. She kept walking. She kept showing up. She taught her classes. She bought groceries at the local market even when she heard her name spoken behind her back. She wore her belly with pride, and when the baby first kicked in the middle of a history lesson, she paused, placed a hand over her abdomen, and smiled. And in that moment, she wasn't ashamed. She was proud, because life was growing inside her, and no one could shame her into silence. One afternoon, as she walked through the park with Ryan, a woman stopped them, an older teacher from another school district, someone Isabel barely knew. "I just wanted to say," the woman said, her voice kind and steady, "what you're doing, it's brave." Isabel blinked. "Thank you." "No," the woman insisted. "Really. Don't let them steal your joy." Later, as they sat on a bench by the lake, Ryan turned to her. "Does it ever get easier?" She exhaled slowly. "Not always, but I'm getting stronger." He reached for her hand and brought it to his lips. "I see that." And just as he spoke, the wind picked up, gentle, cool, lifting her hair softly from her shoulders, like a reminder that seasons always change. That night, she wrote in her journal, "They talked, they judged, but they don't carry this child. They don't know the love it was born from, and maybe that's enough." She closed the journal, her fingers brushing her belly as she whispered into the darkness, "You were born from something deeper than fear, and I will teach you that no voice is louder than truth." But as she drifted off to sleep, a new concern began to creep into her thoughts, quiet, subtle, unnamed. She tried to ignore it, tried to rest, but something about the stillness in the room felt like the quiet before another storm. By the time Isabel reached 4.5 months, her body had begun to bloom. Her bump was no longer a secret beneath sweaters or coats. It was real, visible, undeniable. And with every inch it grew, something deeper took root between her and Ryan. It wasn't just the pregnancy, it was the way he looked at her now, like she was carrying a miracle. Like every moment with her, even the ordinary ones, had become sacred. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, he surprised her by showing up at the school gates with a navy blue umbrella and a container of homemade soup. "I figured you didn't have time for lunch," he said, holding it out sheepishly. "It's terrible, probably, but it smells like food." She laughed and took it. "You made soup?" "Kind of. I called my assistant's grandmother. She walked me through it. You don't even like soup." "I know. But you do." It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it made her heart swell in a way nothing else had that week. At their next appointment, the doctor turned the monitor toward them and smiled. "Want to know the gender?" Isabel turned to Ryan, her breath catching. "You ready?" she whispered. He nodded. The doctor's voice was soft but clear. "It's a boy." There was a silence, thick with awe. Ryan's hand found hers instinctively, squeezing it with a trembling grip. A boy. A son. Isabel turned to look at him, and for the first time she saw tears in his eyes. He didn't wipe them away, he just smiled and whispered, "He's already perfect." That evening, back at her cottage, they sat on the floor in front of the fireplace, surrounded by tiny clothes and name books, all spread out in a chaotic circle. Ryan was more invested than she ever expected. "What about Noah?" he asked, flipping through a page. "It means rest." "Too common," she replied, sipping hot chocolate. "And he's not just any boy." He paused, then smiled. "What about Liam?" She looked up. "Liam? It means strong-willed warrior." Her hand instinctively moved to her belly. "Liam Cooper Thompson," she whispered aloud, testing the sound. "It fits." Ryan reached out and gently placed his palm against her stomach. "Hi, Liam," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "We've been waiting for you." Their love didn't erupt like fireworks. It grew like ivy. Steady, persistent, wrapping around every moment, every silence, every gesture. He began to show up more often, to rub her lower back when she couldn't find a comfortable position, to build a small wooden cradle by hand, even though she offered to buy one, to read baby books and take notes in the margins. And every night when he kissed her goodbye, his lips lingered just a little longer. "I don't want to leave," he confessed once, standing in the doorway long after midnight. "Then don't," she whispered. He didn't. On Sundays, they started attending the small church Isabel had grown up in. At first, people stared, but when Ryan stood beside her, hand resting gently on the curve of her belly, something in the room softened. After the service, an elderly woman approached them, her smile genuine. "You two," she said, eyes bright, "look like you've known each other forever." Isabel smiled. "In many ways, we have." With each passing week, Ryan's fascination with the pregnancy deepened. He read articles about fetal development. He downloaded a baby app and sent her daily updates. "Your son is the size of an avocado." But more than that, he listened. To her fears about motherhood, to her guilt about not being married, to her dreams of lullabies and nighttime feedings and soft baby clothes hanging in the sun. He didn't try to fix anything, he just stayed. And somehow, that was everything. One night, as they lay together in bed, Isabel stirred. "Are you awake?" she whispered. Ryan murmured, "Mm-hmm. Can I tell you something a little crazy? Always. I think I love him already," she said, her hand over her belly. "Even though I've never seen his face." Ryan reached over and covered her hand with his. "I do too." There was a pause. Then she added, voice barely audible, "And I love you." His breath caught. And then he said, "I've loved you since before I understood what love really meant." She turned to him in the dark, and in that stillness, without needing proof or ceremony or definition, they both knew, whatever this was, it had already become forever. A few days later, Ryan brought a surprise. "I bought a house." Isabel blinked. "What?" He handed her the keys. "It's a little outside town. Quiet. Big yard. Room for a swing. A garden. A nursery. I want it to be ours." She stared at the keys in her hand, breathless. "But I love my cottage." "I know." We can stay here as long as you want, but someday soon I want to carry you over a threshold, not because I bought a house, but because we built a life." Tears rose before she could stop them. "I don't care about big houses, Ryan. I don't either. I care about waking up next to you, watching Liam take his first steps on that floor, sitting on that porch when we're old." She threw her arms around him, and in that moment, there was no wealth, no gossip, no fear. Only future, only family. But not everything was smooth. One night, Isabel stood in front of her bedroom mirror, her hands pressed to her round stomach. She stared at the stretch marks starting to form, the soft swell of her hips, the heaviness in her legs. "Will you still want me?" she asked Ryan later, voice trembling. He pulled her gently into his arms. "I don't love you for the shape of your waist," he said. "I love you for the way your eyes go soft when you talk to our son, for the way you held my grief when no one else could see it, for every part of you that has made room for life, including mine." And when he kissed her, she believed him. On a bright Sunday morning, as birds sang outside the window and the smell of pancakes filled the kitchen, Isabel felt Liam move, really move for the first time. She gasped, dropping the spatula. Ryan turned, startled. "What? Are you okay?" She grabbed his hand and pressed it gently to her belly. "There," she whispered. "Feel that?" And then it came again. A soft, strong kick. Ryan's eyes filled with tears. "He's real," he said, as if he'd just been handed the final proof his heart had always hoped for. "He's coming," Isabel whispered, smiling. "And he already knows you." They stood in the kitchen, wrapped in each other, the smell of syrup in the air, the sound of life within her, and the love between them growing louder than ever before. The garden smelled of rosemary and rain. It had rained softly in the early morning, just enough to wash the air and bring out the earthy sweetness of the soil. Now, as golden hour set the world ablaze in gentle amber, Isabel stood barefoot beneath the old elm tree in her backyard, not knowing that Ryan was about to change her life again. She wore a flowing white sundress that clung gently to her rounded belly, and her hair was loosely braided over one shoulder. She was humming, an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing, when she noticed Ryan coming through the back gate. He was holding something behind his back, her eyes narrowed playfully. "What are you hiding?" Ryan just smiled. "Come with me," he said. She gave him a look. "I'm 8 months pregnant. If this is another spontaneous walk through the woods." He took her hand gently. "No woods. Just trust me." He led her through the garden path toward the back of the property, where string lights were draped across the trees like tiny stars, flickering softly in the evening light. The space was empty, except for a path of white petals, winding toward a circle of rose bushes and a single wooden bench, and in the center of the bench, a small velvet box. Isabel stopped walking. Ryan turned to her, his voice quiet, reverent. "I've waited a long time to say this the right way," he began. "We started this journey with uncertainty, with a promise made out of friendship, but everything that came after, every moment with you, has shown me something I didn't think I'd ever find." Her hand rose slowly to her heart. "You made me believe in love, not because you said the words, but because you lived them. Every day, in the way you carry life, in the way you carry me." He knelt down, not just to propose, but because he was already surrendered. From his pocket, he pulled the ring. Simple, elegant, timeless. "Isabel Thompson," he said, voice cracking, "will you marry me, not out of obligation or because of this baby, but because my heart is yours, and it always has been?" Tears spilled freely down her cheeks. She didn't answer with words. She simply nodded and dropped to her knees with him, belly between them, her forehead resting against his. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times. "Yes." They didn't wait long. 2 weeks later, beneath the old stained glass windows of the small chapel where Isabel had gone every Sunday as a girl, they were married in a ceremony so intimate it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Only a handful of people were there. Mrs. Martha Bell, beaming with a smile that made Isabel cry all over again. A few close friends. Ryan's sister, who flew in from Seattle and wept openly as her brother slipped the ring onto Isabel's finger. There was no string quartet, no dramatic aisle. Just Isabel glowing in a white maternity dress that fell around her like a whisper, and Ryan unable to stop looking at her like she was the beginning and end of everything. The vows were simple, not rehearsed, not memorized. Just truth, spoken in trembling voices. "I don't promise perfection," Isabel said, her hands gently resting over her belly. "But I promise presence. I promise to stay when it's quiet, to hold your hand when it shakes, to love you in the softest, loudest ways I know." Ryan wiped a tear from his cheek before speaking. "I promise to never stop choosing you, even on the hard days, even in silence, even when we're tired or lost or growing in ways we didn't expect. I'll be yours, every step." When the pastor said, "You may kiss your bride," Ryan kissed her slowly, gently, as if time had slowed for this one moment, and perhaps it had. Outside the chapel, the world felt quiet, as if it too was wrapped in the hush of something holy. They stood beneath the white blooming tree in the yard, surrounded by soft laughter, warm hugs, and the scent of roses on the breeze. Liam kicked gently, as if celebrating with them. Isabel rested a hand over her belly and smiled. "He approves," she said. Ryan leaned in, pressing a kiss to her temple. Smart kid. Later that evening, instead of a grand reception, they returned to her cottage. Their cottage. He had insisted they stay there for now until the baby arrived. Inside, candles flickered on every surface. A homemade dinner waited on the stove. Martha's doing, no doubt, but neither of them touched it. They danced slowly in the middle of the living room, barefoot, no music, just the rhythm of their breaths and the heartbeat they both felt coming from inside her. "I can't believe you're my wife," Ryan murmured, his voice low against her neck. "I can't believe I waited so long to say yes." That night, lying in bed beside him, Isabel watched him sleep with a peace she hadn't known in years. The wedding had been small, the house was modest, but her heart felt more full than any mansion, any ceremony, any fairy tale ever could have promised. She turned onto her side, one hand on her belly, the other brushing softly across his chest. And just before she closed her eyes, she whispered aloud, "We were never just a contract. We were always becoming this." But as peaceful as the night had been, the days ahead held something no one expected. Because sometimes, right after the most beautiful calm, comes the first distant sound of labor. It started with a whisper, a dull cramp just below her belly at 3 in the morning, subtle enough that Isabel turned over in bed, thinking maybe it was just something she ate. But 5 minutes later it returned, sharper this time, low and insistent. Beside her, Ryan stirred. "Everything okay?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Isabel inhaled slowly, eyes closed. I think this is it." That woke him up instantly. He sat up, blinking in the darkness. "You mean now?" She nodded, breath catching. "It's early, but I think so. The contractions, they've started." Ryan was already out of bed, grabbing his phone, sliding on shoes, speaking gently but urgently. "Okay, we're ready. We have the bags. I'll call Dr. Green. Just breathe, Isabel. I've got you." She managed to smile, though her entire body was tightening again. "I know." The drive to the hospital was quiet, except for the sound of her breathing and the occasional squeeze of Ryan's hand from the passenger seat. The streets of Willow Creek were empty, still bathed in moonlight. Every stoplight felt like a countdown. In between contractions, Isabel stared out the window, her thoughts tangled with adrenaline and disbelief. The child she had carried beneath her heart for 9 months was ready to meet the world. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she would be, because love had already made room. By the time they reached the hospital, the contractions were 5 minutes apart and growing stronger. Nurses met them at the entrance, guiding her to a delivery suite with soft lighting and muted walls. Ryan never left her side. Hours passed. Time became something liquid and formless. Pain came in waves, rising, crashing, pulling her under, only to let her surface again just long enough to gasp for air before the next one hit. Through it all, Ryan held her hand. He didn't speak unless she asked him to. He wiped her forehead with a cool cloth. He whispered, "You're doing amazing," over and over like a mantra. But at one point she broke. She curled over her belly, sobbing into his chest. "I can't do this," she whispered. "It hurts too much." He pulled her face up with both hands, his eyes locked on hers. "Yes, you can," he said, voice low but steady. "Because you're already doing it. You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone." Her tears slowed, not because the pain stopped, but because she remembered who she was and who she was becoming. After 12 hours, her body was exhausted, but she was fully dilated. The room changed. Nurses moved quickly. The doctor returned, and the air became electric with purpose. Isabel was trembling. Ryan stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, the other gripping hers tightly. "You're almost there," the doctor said gently. "With the next push, I want you to give me everything you've got." Isabel looked at Ryan, and in his eyes she found her strength. The next minutes were a blur of pain, breath, pressure, and something ancient rising from within her. A scream escaped her lips, raw and full. Then, a cry. Not hers, but Liam's. A sound so pure and small, yet powerful enough to crack the universe open. Isabel collapsed back into the bed, chest heaving, body shaking. The room blurred as a nurse placed a warm, slippery bundle onto her chest. And then, time stopped. Liam, tiny, red-faced, crying with all the life in his lungs. She stared at him, her hands shaking as they instinctively cradled him closer. He was perfect. He was real. He was theirs. Ryan knelt beside the bed, brushing a tear from her cheek as he looked at his son for the first time. "Hi," he whispered, voice trembling. "Hey, little warrior." Liam let out another cry, softer now, as if answering. Isabel looked up at Ryan, her face wet with tears, her heart bursting. "You're a father," she said. "And you," he replied, kissing her forehead, "are the strongest woman I've ever known." The hours that followed passed in a sacred hush. Liam was cleaned, weighed, wrapped in a soft blanket, and placed gently in Ryan's arms. He stared down at his son with a reverence Isabel had never seen in him before. "Look at him," he said, his voice thick. "He has your nose. And your mouth," she whispered, smiling weakly from the bed. Ryan sat beside her, still holding Liam. "We did it," he said. "No," she replied softly. "We're just beginning." Later, when the room emptied and only the three of them remained, Ryan lay beside her in the hospital bed, careful not to disturb the tiny, sleeping figure on her chest. They said nothing for a while, just listened to the slow, rhythmic breathing of a newborn, to the hum of machines, to the sound of hearts learning a new rhythm. "I've never been this scared in my life," Ryan confessed. "Me neither," Isabel said, "but I've also never loved anything so much." He leaned in and kissed the top of her head. "I love you," he said. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it, every time you look at him." Just before sunrise, Isabel shifted slightly, watching the sky outside turn from black to deep violet. The first light of day kissed Liam's face, and she felt the weight of everything she'd been through, every judgment, every fear, every moment of doubt, fade into something holy. This was their family, unexpected, unconventional, unshakable. She traced a finger along her son's cheek and whispered, "You are loved, you are wanted, you were made in love." And Ryan, now half asleep beside her, murmured, "He was made from us." But just as the sun began to rise fully over the city, the hospital door creaked open. A nurse stepped inside, her expression unreadable. "There's someone here asking for you," she said to Isabel. "She says it's urgent." Isabel frowned, heart tightening. "Who?" The nurse hesitated. "She says she's your mother." 6 months had passed since Liam's birth, and the world no longer looked the same. It had shrunk and expanded at once, into midnight feedings, the scent of baby lotion, and the softness of his tiny fingers wrapping around theirs, into sleepy mornings filled with laughter, laundry, lullabies, and the constant overwhelming wonder of how someone so small could shift the axis of two grown hearts. For Isabel, motherhood had redefined time. Minutes could stretch endlessly during Liam's colicky hours, but a month would vanish like a heartbeat. She'd returned to teaching part-time, her students greeting her with hand-drawn cards and cautious hugs. The whispers were gone now. replaced with admiration, even respect. The parents who once doubted her stood a little taller in her presence. Perhaps it was her strength. Or perhaps it was the way Ryan walked beside her every time he picked her up from school. Liam snug in a carrier against his chest, like they had always been a trio. In the quiet moments, after Liam had been fed and changed, after Ryan had made coffee just the way she liked, Isabel often sat on the porch, her son cradled against her heart, and simply breathed. The life she had once imagined felt far away. But this life felt earned, sacred, theirs. It hadn't always been smooth. There were still disagreements about schedules, fatigue, how many blankets Liam actually needed. There were nights when Isabel cried from exhaustion, her body aching, her nerves frayed. And there were days when Ryan struggled to turn off the CEO part of his brain and simply be present. But they always came back to the same center, to love, to Liam, to each other. Her mother's visit, however, had left something open that took months to fully mend. The woman who had once abandoned Isabel with silence and shame had shown up in that hospital room unannounced, eyes tired, voice trembling, claiming she wanted to make amends. Isabel had listened, not because she owed forgiveness, but because she refused to let bitterness raise her child. They spoke quietly for an hour. There were tears, there was honesty, and there was a choice to let the past stay behind them. Ryan hadn't said much after, but that night he wrapped his arms around her and whispered, "You're breaking cycles without even realizing it." And maybe that was the real victory. Spring arrived like a soft hymn. Liam was sitting up now, giggling more than crying, obsessed with the sound of paper crinkling and the texture of grass beneath his fingers. Ryan worked fewer hours. Sometimes he brought his laptop out onto the porch just to be near them, Isabel grading papers, Liam babbling to his toes. It was in one of those quiet afternoons, sunlight pouring through the trees, that Isabel realized something. This wasn't the life she had settled for. This was the life she had created, brick by brick, choice by choice, breath by breath. One weekend, Ryan took her by surprise. He had organized a picnic under the giant oak tree on the new property, the same one where he had first proposed building a future together. The house was still being finished, but the land was theirs now. The foundation had been poured, literally and metaphorically. As the three of them sat in the grass, the baby cooing between them, Ryan turned to her. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, pulling something small from his pocket. Not a ring, but a key. "To the new house," he smiled. "And to anything else you're ready to open next." She took it slowly, fingers brushing his. And in that quiet moment, they didn't need big declarations. Their story had never been about spectacle. It had been about showing up, staying, choosing love again and again, even when it wasn't part of the plan. Especially then. Later that night, Isabel stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair. Liam had fallen asleep against Ryan's chest in the nursery, and the house was wrapped in that sacred hush only young families know. Part exhaustion, part bliss. She studied her reflection. Same eyes, same freckles, but the woman staring back was different, softer, stronger, braver. She had crossed oceans of fear, storms of judgment, and valleys of vulnerability to arrive here, in this home, in this love, in this truth. And when Ryan appeared behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing his lips to her shoulder, she closed her eyes and smiled. They were a family, unexpected, unconventional, unbreakable. One night, long after Liam had fallen asleep and the dishes had been put away, Ryan sat beside her on the couch holding a cup of tea. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think love was something loud, obvious, like fireworks. And now?" she asked, leaning into his shoulder. "Now I think it sounds more like this," he said, motioning to the quiet room, the baby monitor humming softly, the wind brushing gently against the windows. "Like steady breathing, like hands brushing in the dark." She smiled. "I think it sounds like a baby's heartbeat," she said. He kissed her forehead. "Or like the sound your voice makes when you say my name." The past no longer haunted them. The future no longer frightened them, because they had built something stronger than chance. They had built a home, not with bricks, but with belief, not with perfect timing, but with trust. And as they stood together one Sunday morning, holding their son beneath the blooming trees, Isabel whispered something into Liam's ear. "You were born from love, not the kind that waits for the world's permission, but the kind that grows in silence and makes everything new." She didn't dream of a fairy tale. She only dreamed of a love that would stay. And he didn't seek a happy ending, just someone who could see who he was behind it all. In the end, it wasn't the plan that brought them together. It was the daily, silent choice to stay. And maybe the real miracle of this story was discovering that the strongest family is the one that's born when no one else believes. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us, where are you listening from? Your support helps us continue sharing stories that warm the heart.